For the first time in a long time, we must begin this report with an urgent warning. Do not keep wild animals in your backyard. This is not an exaggeration or a moral whim. It is a plea based on a tragedy that could have been easily avoided. Keeping wild creatures confined in a domestic space, surrounded by families, children, pets, and unsuspecting neighbors, is not only irresponsible, it is a ticking time bomb. And yet, for years, this particular situation played out in plain sight, in broad daylight, with no authority stepping in to stop it. That no one has been killed before is, frankly, a miracle that defies all logic. Before we get back to the story, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story has moved you, be sure to subscribe. We're almost at 100,000, and because tomorrow I have something very special in store for you. For decades, the unusual sounds coming from a particular garden were assumed to be part of the neighborhood's eccentricity. The roars, screeches, howls, and trills were not only ignored, but became part of the community's everyday soundscape. It's easy now to judge that indifference, but the truth is that when something dangerous becomes routine, most people simply incorporate it into their normal lives. And so, for years, an ordinary house with a rusty iron gate and a weathered brick wall became a kind of clandestine zoo in the heart of a residential neighborhood. Aqil Fakhr was not an extraordinary man at first glance. Tall, thin, with sun-baked skin, and always dressed in a traditional dishdasha that was already showing signs of wear, he looked like one of thousands in southern Iraq. He lived in Nehaf, a hot, dusty town where houses are crammed together, separated only by narrow alleys and sidewalks filled with children. He spent his entire life there, 50 years breathing the same hot air, walking on the same cracked ground, greeting the same neighbors, many of whom considered him a kind, if reserved man. His house, located at the end of a dead-end street, was unremarkable in size and decor. It was a modest concrete structure without luxuries, but with a surprisingly large backyard for urban standards. That backyard was where, far from prying eyes, or so he believed, he began to build his own world. But what he cultivated there were not flowers, fruit trees, or a place to rest. What Aqil raised were beasts. No one ever knew exactly how it started. Some neighbors claim it all began with a pair of colorful parrots he brought home in covered cages. Then came the small monkeys, one of which supposedly managed to escape and was found on the roof of a school. Little by little, the repertoire expanded. Metal cages began to appear in the garden, some covered with tarpaulins, others in plain sight, but all noisy. It was said that Aqil bought the animals from traffickers, possibly from Turkey, Syria, or even Africa, and that he paid in cash, leaving no trace. Others said he had contacts with former members of the army who knew how to move shipments without raising suspicion. The truth is that Aqil had no license or visible permits for what he was doing. In Iraq, the keeping of exotic animals is heavily restricted. The authorities impose extremely high taxes to discourage the importation of foreign species and require those who do obtain authorization to comply with strict standards of care, feeding, and safety. The logic is simple. If you can't afford to keep it, you can't take care of it. But Aqil seemed to move in the shadows of that logic, dodging rules with a skill that no one quite understood, and his house was not equipped for that kind of activity. The cages were old, reused, hand-welded with materials he found in local markets. The wall surrounding the garden was no more than 4 meters high at its highest point, and there was no double fence, no reinforced locks, no surveillance camera systems. There wasn't even a basic alarm. The cage doors often creaked in the wind, and some showed signs of corrosion from the animal's urine. Despite all this, the neighbors simply accepted the situation as part of Aqil's eccentricity. The neighborhood children knew that if they walked past the garden at dusk, they would hear distant howls, brief roars, or even piercing screeches that gave them nightmares. Some said they could see eyes glowing through the bars when they looked through the gaps in the wall. Others swore they had heard the dry growl of a bear or the snap of a crocodile hitting its cage. However, their parents told them not to say anything. "Leave him alone," they whispered. "That man doesn't bother anyone." And they were right, in part. Aqil was friendly. He always said hello, helped carry bags at the mosque, offered dates during Ramadan, and was never seen acting aggressively. But that was all a facade. Hidden within that courtyard was an illegal animal trade involving species that shouldn't even have been on that continent. In May 2025, Aqil acquired a new specimen that, according to everyone, was the beginning of the end. It was an African lion, young but already with a budding mane that gave it an imposing presence. It was no cub. It was a creature in the throes of adulthood, with developed muscles, sharp claws, and a territorial instinct that needed only a provocation to be activated. No one knows how he got it, or how much he paid for it, or who he was planning to sell it to. What is known is that this beast was not meant to live locked up in a rusty iron cage under the harsh sun, with no room to run or hunt. During the first few days, Aqil repeated a pattern he knew well. He approached cautiously, leaving fresh food and clean water. He spoke to it in a low voice, trying to establish a minimal bond of trust. He carried a long metal stick with him, not so much for defense as to command respect. Felines learn quickly to fear pain. After a week, when the lion no longer tried to attack him every time he approached, Aqil knew it was time to begin the most risky part of the training, letting him out into the yard. He chose the moment carefully. He knew that during the hottest hours of the day, lions become slow and heavy, seeking shade rather than conflict. He also fed him just before, hoping that digestion would make him more docile. It wasn't the first time he had released a large predator into his backyard. He had done it before with Bengal tigers and Sri Lankan leopards. The procedure was always the same: open cage, stick in hand, calm words, extreme vigilance. From the roof of the neighboring house, an elderly man drank tea under a canvas umbrella, enjoying the slight breeze that blew between the houses. He watched Aqil slowly open the cage. He saw the lion poke its snout out, sniff the air, take a step, then another. Everything seemed to be going as usual, nothing out of the ordinary. But then something changed. The roar of one of the birds of paradise sounded louder than usual. The zebras began to neigh, and the foxes screeched in unison. The lion tensed. What should have been a peaceful stroll through the garden turned in seconds into a scene of panic. The feline perceived the chaos as a threat. The combination of noise, heat, the enclosed environment, and the recent pain of the cane punishments built up in his young mind. The reaction was instinctive, violent, and inevitable. The attack was not preceded by a roar or a warning signal. It was so sudden, so violent, so perfectly feline that even the neighbor who witnessed it from the rooftop took a few seconds to understand what was happening. A moment before, the lion had been taking slow steps, his back rising and falling with slow breaths. A second later, all the tension built up in his muscles exploded with the precision of a spring being released. His body shot forward with a speed that seemed unnatural for such a large, young animal. Aqil had no time to react beyond raising his metal stick and bringing it down hard on the animal's snout. It was an automatic gesture, learned and repeated dozens of times with other predators. But this time, it was useless. The stick, which on previous occasions had been enough to stop a tiger or command respect from a leopard, was completely ignored. The lion did not see it as a threat, but as a final provocation. What he felt on his face was not pain, but confirmation. This man was an enemy, not a master. With brutal agility, the lion pounced on Aqil and knocked him down as if he were a ragdoll. He crushed him with his front paws, sinking more than 100 kilos of muscle, bone, and claws into his chest. Aqil fell on his back, and although he tried to scream, the lion's roar drowned out his voice like a storm drowns out the sound of a single drop. He tried to hit it again, but it was too late. The animal, in a movement as efficient as it was terrifying, lowered its head and sank its fangs into his throat. It was as if time had frozen. Aqil stopped moving almost instantly. Blood spurted out in a dark stream, soaking his dish dasher, turning it from pale grey to a grotesque red. He was still breathing, irregularly, as if his lungs were trying to draw air that could no longer pass through his shattered neck. His hands clung weakly to the lion's sparse mane, not in a real attempt to defend himself, but as a last human reflex to want to live. But the lion, its jaw still clenched, began to shake him again and again, as it would a dying prey on the savannah. From the top of his rooftop, the neighbor saw clearly as the life drained from his friend's body. The teacup in his hand fell and shattered on the concrete floor. He didn't think, he just reacted. He ran down the stairs, yelling at his wife to call the police, the army, anyone. He entered a back room, opened a rusty trunk, and pulled out an old Kalashnikov rifle wrapped in a wool blanket. It was a relic from his years in the military, a time he had sworn to leave behind. But in that moment, his protective instinct overcame everything else. Barefoot, wearing only his leather sandals, he loaded the weapon as he ran across the alleyway leading to Aqil's backyard. He knew he couldn't jump the wall. He wasn't suicidal. But he climbed onto an old metal container that had been abandoned near the wall, and from there he could clearly see the horror unfolding below him. The lion, covered in blood, had not only killed Aqil, it had already begun to devour him. First, it was the upper thigh, where the muscles are thick and the flesh soft. Then it moved on to the abdomen, tearing through clothing and skin with the instinctive precision of a wild hunter. The neighbor aimed his rifle, but did not fire immediately. He hesitated. He hoped the authorities would arrive. He thought they might be able to calm the animal, capture it, and stop the nightmare without killing it. Perhaps he even thought that Aqil could still be saved. But those thoughts vanished in the minutes that followed, as the lion continued to eat, now biting into the lower back of its victim. The scene was too gruesome to describe without disgust. Torn flesh, exposed bones, pieces of intestine exposed to the midday sun. 20 long minutes passed before the first police cars began to arrive. They slammed on their brakes when they saw the armed man on top of the dumpster, who shouted frantically at them not to approach without being prepared. The neighborhood was already empty. The children had been taken away, the adults hidden in their homes. The attack was already common knowledge. Everyone knew there was a lion on the loose. Everyone knew who had died. At first, the officers couldn't believe the report. A lion eating a man in a residential garden. But hearing the growls and seeing the blood spilled was enough to turn disbelief into action. They surrounded the perimeter. Some tried to approach with tranquilizer darts. Others shouted instructions. Others just watched with pale faces. From his elevated position, the neighbor was still aiming at the lion. He told them to hurry up. He told them there was nothing left to save, that the body was already unrecognizable. The discussion about whether to capture or kill the animal lasted barely a minute longer. As soon as they saw that the lion was not moving away from the body, but was now beginning to tear off part of the torso, they realized they had no choice. The order to shoot was given. The first bullets hit the animal's back, and it reared up immediately, glaring furiously at the source of the shots. It roared with rage, splattered with blood, defiant even in its last seconds of life. They kept shooting. 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Nothing. The lion was still standing. Finally, from atop the dumpster, the neighbor fired one last shot, aiming for the head. The bullet entered through the left eye and exited through the back of the neck. The body fell instantly, heavily, onto the carcass it had already torn apart. The silence was almost as brutal as the attack. No one moved. No one breathed. Only then did they lower their weapons. What remained of Aqil was little more than an indistinguishable mass of flesh, crushed bone and torn fabric. His family received an incomplete, unrecognizable body. The process of recovering the corpse was painful and grotesque. Part of the remains had to be extracted from the animal's digestive tract during the autopsy. It was not a burial. It was an emergency cremation, with some parts in a sealed box and others simply lost forever. To date, the Iraqi government has offered no explanation. There have been no official statements on how Aqil was able to maintain an illegal zoo in the middle of a residential neighborhood for decades without anyone inspecting his property. There are no public records of import licenses in his name, no animal health reports, no sales certificates, no veterinary inspection records. The question remains, was this a case of corruption, a total failure on the part of the authorities, a network of local complicity? And if it wasn't legal, why didn't anyone report it? The neighbors knew. Some even admired him. Others simply ignored him. And many were afraid. Afraid of reprisals, afraid of the authorities, afraid of being wrong. But the collective silence allowed a potentially deadly situation to become normalized to the point where a lion ended up killing and eating its owner without anyone being able to prevent it. In the end, it doesn't matter whether what Aqil was doing was legal or illegal. What matters is that it happened, that it was allowed, that it was ignored, and that opens the door to a much more disturbing truth. If this could happen in an ordinary city with an ordinary man, then it could be happening elsewhere too. Maybe right now, in another neighborhood, someone is feeding a tiger in their garage. Maybe another man has poisonous snakes in his basement. Maybe a child is playing next to a wall behind which there is another lion waiting for someone to make a mistake. Wild animals turned into living weapons by human negligence. Living beings locked up, frustrated, hungry for space, for freedom, and for justice. Because everything that is locked up against its will one day seek to escape, and when it does, it will not do so with pleas or lamentations. It will do so with teeth, claws, and rage. Just like that lion did. Just like others will do. Just like all of them would do.